Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I am glad to welcome Matt Slutsky. He's a senior account manager over here. I did want to mention before we hop right into our topic for the day. So, for a while, we've been known as the Nerd Rabbit Podcast. This was started under our Nerd Rabbit company as a way to talk about cloud topics around staffing and talent and the nature of our industry. And as we've resurrected it this year, it's been in a kind of transitional period for Nerd Rabbit as a company where we've merged with our sister company, ReluTech. Nerd Rabbit really now exemplifies our software platform, which, as many of you know, it's where we're able to work on consulting levels, on gig work levels, for permanent staffing levels to try and help people find the talent they need in this cloud space. But because the topics of this podcast extend past that, whether it be infrastructure topics we brought on, whether it be more hands-on cloud topics we brought on, we felt it'd be more appropriate to now brand this the ReluTech Podcast. So going forward, welcome to the ReluTech Podcast. Now, again, I am welcoming Matt Slutsky. He has been on our team for nearly a year now, I think, right?
Yeah, almost 7 months at this point.
Yeah, so as far as it goes, I know it feels long because since you've been here, I know you made a pretty big impact, particularly in the staffing arena. It's something that I know you have a background in, but feel free to introduce yourself to our viewers. Tell them a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm based up here in New York City. I'm no stranger to the staffing world. I have over 10 years of experience on both sides of the staffing table. So initially, I started my career at a boutique tech staffing agency in New York City. Started as a recruiter, worked my way up to being a full desk account manager. So I was doing a combination of sales and recruiting. And then in 2018, I moved over in-house to an AWS Premier partner called LogicWorks at the time. Spent the last 6 years there through a bunch of reorganization and transformation up until the point that they were acquired by Cox Communications, a huge telecom company down in Atlanta. And then the company merged with another partner called RapidScale. My role evolved quite a bit over that time. I went from being on a team of myself plus three to myself plus 125 recruiters supporting a 10,000 plus person business. So that led me to ReluTech. I wanted to come back to a smaller, more intimate setting where I had more influence on the outcome of the company and the performance of the company and my own personal performance. So I came here and like Chris was saying, I kind of work in a dual fashion here as well. I am running also a full desk here. So I do a combination of recruiting and account management. So when I work with you as the commercial face of the ReluTech business, I'm also the recruiter on the back end.
Yeah, and we actually have some similarity in our background. We both did technical recruiting before we moved in our respective directions, where you started taking on the full desk and then moving on to where you could kind of work in that AWS partner space, which was something that I was transitioning into as we started Nerd Rabbit and I became a product manager. But recruiting is really something that has been if the opportunity as a product manager hadn't arisen, I'm not sure I would have left recruiting. Sometimes you just take the paths that seem appealing at the time. You're not really sure. It wasn't on the table beforehand, right? But recruiting was something I loved because I'm a curious person. It teaches you a lot about an industry when you're recruiting in it, how the industry is moving, what's important to companies at any given time. So I think that's a lot of what we want to talk about in this conversation, really this state of staffing in the tech world in 2024. Because it's changed a lot since I left it for sure from the recruiting side. I have been a product manager for about 5 years now. So in these 5 years, it's been just leaps and bounds of change. So to start with that, we have seen a pandemic. We've seen an economy that has been obviously very up and down in a lot of places, which has created a lot of, feast or famine in some ways. And now there's AI, which is just one of those generational shifts in technology, which in our industry obviously could be even more pronounced. So walk me through some of the big trends that you've been seeing. What are some of the key shifts, I guess, along the way that you saw leading to today?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start back in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. We were in the midst of what a lot of people have coined the competition for talent phase. This was like a 2.5 year era where there were an enormous amount of jobs and not enough applicants. So the people who were, the people like myself who were on the side of hiring were having an extremely tough time finding the right talent because they were happily employed and making very good salaries and bonuses and having great benefits. What we've seen now is an inverse of that. So really from, I want to say like 2023 to present, um, the inverse has happened. There's a ton of candidates on the market, and the reason for that is overhiring in big tech, and a lot of that kind of precipitates from the economy and economic factors like inflation. So right now, what you're seeing is skill sets that were normally really hard to find, like a senior full stack developer, like a senior DevOps engineer, are available in droves. And what that's done is it's driven down the price point for a lot of these individuals. So, as an example, and this is more hypothetical, if you were going to hire a DevOps engineer in 2021, back during the competition for talent, you were going to pay 180K plus for that individual because everyone was looking for that same person and it was pushing up their price tag. Today, the need is not there as much, less jobs available. Maybe that person is going to get $20,000 to $25,000 less on a salary basis. Yep. Right. So all these economic factors kind of drive the pendulum to where we are now. I would say, Chris, luckily, I think we're coming out of this dry spell and we're starting to see the job market come back. We've seen it in economic reports come out from the government. But, in real practical settings, like me being in my job every day, working with small to medium-sized businesses as well as enterprises, it's coming back.
Yeah, and what you mentioned about overhiring was, I think, a really interesting component of really the pandemic in general. So the pandemic forced, obviously, a lot of companies to open their doors to remote work. This meant they could hire people anywhere. So that changed a lot of companies' mentalities. And people were obviously competing for talent that was anywhere. But certain companies had more money to spend. And they hired all the talent because they could afford to. And they thought they had a good place to put all of these talented people. And now that we can hire people anywhere, we can be really ambitious. And eventually, not every plan shook out. Inflation went up, which drove up their cost of doing business, right? They're obviously worried about their stock reports, and it forced a lot of these CEOs to make those tough choices, right? To look at, okay, is our business making sense right now? And I think that a lot of them, whatever their ambition was, positive as it may have been, it was maybe a little bit overly optimistic. And we've seen the shift back, whether it be that some companies feel they should do things in the office or be more on the remote side, but trying to be more lean, more measured about how companies operate. And as the economy gets better, I think we are seeing more of these job openings come back. I think it was particularly restricted for job openings even after the massive layoffs when, interest rates were high, the cost of doing business was high.
Yep. I think about it somewhat similar to what it was pre-pandemic. I could speak for myself in that I worked in a company culture from 2018 to 2020 where everyone came to the office 5 days a week. And you had a community there and you were able to do things and see people's faces and interact with one another and collaborate with one another. I'm seeing a lot of companies implement a lot of these RTO, return to office policies. Namely, one of our biggest partners, AWS, is very famous for doing that now. And they've done it a few times over the last couple of years. And it's certainly going to impact a lot of the people during the time of the pandemic who were given the leeway to go relocate to name your desirable lower cost of living location than some of these big cities where there's a great population of these employees.
Yeah. And as far as it goes, I think it will all shake out in the end. We're obviously in just such a seismic kind of shift of all of this happening. And I think some companies that do the RTO, there's going to be some creative benefits they might gain that they can really capitalize on, as well as the fact they can have kind of control over, the real estate they have. There's a lot of potential benefits. And for other companies who do believe in the remote mentality, that gives them a talent pool to work with. For people who now live in I want to only be remote, there's not maybe a ton of tech jobs where I live rurally or something. And other companies will then compete for that.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. So what I do here is primarily work with small and medium-sized businesses in the Northeast. So I would say out of, let's say, 10 jobs that I've recently filled for these customers, 9 out of the 10 candidates were looking to leave their current job because of a RTO policy that was preventing them from relocating, right? They don't want to relocate. They're happy where they are. They want another company. And usually that next company is probably a smaller business that doesn't have as stringent in-office policies, right? And I guess to extrapolate upon that a little bit further, I was speaking to somebody yesterday. Even if that person returned to office, they're sitting at a hoteling desk, so they don't even have a dedicated desk. And then the team that they're on is globally distributed anyways. So it's not like if they go back to their regional office, they'll even have that FaceTime with their colleagues on their team.
Yeah, I've seen that in a lot of these positions. And again, it's complicated for a lot of these companies. How to, once you go RTO, I mean, before the pandemic, a lot of these offices, I mean, there was a lot of almost psychology into how offices were designed. And then it's kind of like, knock the bowling pins over, rack it back up, start again with a pandemic. So I think there's definitely, even when you get everyone back in the office, how do you make this work the best it can? I think that's a whole nother hurdle for the companies taking that path. Again, we don't know the future. I don't really have any right answers for it. I just think it's going to create some struggles for some people on the job market, but I think it'll also open up some opportunities for those job seekers, but as well as the companies looking to snatch up that talent. Now, speaking of the type of talent that companies are snatching up right now, there's been some shifts, not just in terms of wages going really high during the pandemic, but just in general, the types of skill sets that are currently more valued on the market versus others. So let's walk through that a little bit of these last 5 years. What kind of jobs have really started seeing increases in what their value is on the open market versus others that maybe were in a lot greater demand a few years ago?
Yeah, I mean, what we saw, let's say 5 years ago, was the rise of the hyperscalers, the rise of the public cloud platforms, especially in technology. The folks who were getting the big salaries and getting the big bonuses were folks that had AWS, Azure, GCP certifications, multiple certifications on those platforms, were able to develop in those platforms, were able to architect multi-account governance structures in those platforms. These were the folks that were highly in demand. Now, like I was mentioning before, that's somewhat changed. I would say today, the most high in demand skill set is anything around AI, Gen AI, machine learning. If you're speaking about AWS, we're talking about people who understand how to develop in SageMaker, people who know how to work in RAG, LLMs. Like, this is kind of the next hot thing outside of it just being hot for businesses and productive for businesses. From a personal development and professional development standpoint, I would urge everyone nowadays to go get certified in something AI oriented.
Yeah, that's a big one. And it's something that we're talking about tech roles, SageMaker, all these other tools that are definitely hyper technical. But this isn't just necessarily a piece of advice directed at technical people. Recruiters, salespeople, everyone needs to be utilizing these new tools as they become available. Obviously, using your judgment, making sure that you are still putting out the best quality work, but you're being given a lot of new ammunition that you'd never had in the past. And I'm sure everyone's used ChatGPT for something. You're like, oh, I got to draft this really long email. Let's see how ChatGPT does and clean that up. But I think it goes a lot further than that. There's a lot of really interesting tools out there and ways that people are approaching this. From your standpoint, how are you seeing kind of the use of AI change, I guess the recruiting process? Like, how are you seeing that being used by recruiters?
Yeah, so there's a few things. I can speak to what I do day to day. I am a power LinkedIn recruiter user. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this podcast also leverage LinkedIn Recruiter pretty heavily to find the people for their customers. LinkedIn has been a pioneer in implementing AI features into that platform to be able to recommend and match qualified candidates to recruiters for the jobs they're representing. So it used to be you would have to do long Boolean strings, right, to get very narrow and particular about the skills you're looking to hire for. Today, a lot of that has become like natural language processing, text input that is doing the same work and taking away that manual effort. So that's really the first thing. And then the second thing on the, I would say, in-house side of recruiting, so like how I was 7 months ago and for 6 years before that, we were using applicant tracking systems like Greenhouse, like Bullhorn, Name Your ATS. A lot of those ATSs have now integrated or built out AI functionality within those systems for inbound applications. So when a candidate now uploads their resume, the machine learning is able to parse out, is this person a good fit for this job for whatever reason? You're able to build in logic to those applications to qualify and disqualify people quickly. So it adds to the productivity, thus yielding, higher qualified candidates, quicker time to hire, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and a really big one there, I think, for job seekers. So from their standpoint, they've always known that there's different tools in the recruiting world that are being used to try and filter through. And, there's something to be understood there. In my time in recruiting, I always felt that there was maybe a misunderstanding about why recruiters use filtration tools. One would be that I would maybe post a job for a cloud architect and I'd have a truck driver on LinkedIn apply to it. It'd be really nice if that was filtered out. And when I say a truck driver, I actually mean hundreds of these applications that I am having to then filter through. So this is one of the early reasons you obviously want some basic filtration. But then it does put it on. If you are a qualified candidate, you need to verbalize this, whether it be working with some AI tools to figure out how to make your description of your experience better align with a job description that's available, but really thinking about the words you use. Large language model. Language is the key word there. You have to think about the language you're using. So I'd say with these tools that recruiters are using, the same tools are available to job seekers.
100%. I think the LLMs are becoming very good at looking and sounding like you and I, Chris. Like when we, as a recruiter, ingest or review a resume, sometimes you see things that match up very closely to a job description, but sometimes it's weaved in perfectly.
Yeah.
That's the power of the LLM.
And I don't mind. Honestly, I don't mind if you're weaving it to the job description. If this is a specific story that when I call you, you can speak to it. You can extrapolate, because obviously in your resume, you're not actually going into exceptional detail on these things you've done. These are the highlight reel. That's to get your foot in the door. But then you have to actually show that you can play when you get the tryout. So that I think is a big one. It's like if you've done this work, if you are qualified, that will sort itself out. But you need to get your foot in the door. That's the resume. And these LLMs, key tool right there. It's not just your enemy in some way. It's also your tool.
There's also a dark side of this, Chris. So when someone puts that together but doesn't have the skill sets and they still are able to get through an interview process because they're savvy at using AI, that's when scammers can pop up. So I just want everyone to be aware that there's both sides of that coin.
You have to be, from whether you're a recruiter, the hiring manager, who will be the technical manager of this person. We live in an age of greater discernment. You can't necessarily trust things on the surface that seem like they should be trustworthy on the surface. And this, there's been scams in the job world since before AI. You'd have people interview over the phone or something, and literally someone else would show up to the job on the first day. I mean, it would always be the wildest thing when these would occasionally happen. You're like, how did you think this was going to... You have a different social security name, a name on your social security card. This is never going to work. So it was just, you've always had people trying to take advantage of the system, but I will say we are in a uniquely challenging time.
Yep.
Everyone needs to be aware of the tools that are there and how they might be getting used. Ask specific questions and really drive home with nuance there. As far as it goes, people can try to use these LLMs to cheat their way so far, but eventually, again, when you ask specific questions and need specific answers, kind of puts people's back against a wall a bit.
Yeah. I think there are just so many use cases for AI and Gen AI in the hiring world. Another one I didn't mention before is I'm seeing some of the top tech companies out there leverage chatbots in their application kind of user experience process. So as an applicant, you're able to talk to a chatbot, but get real answers on what is this company going to be like? What's the culture? What are the benefits? Like not having to do a lot of that manual labor and effort to try to find that information on your own. It tells you right there, which
Yeah.
is fantastic.
These chatbots are really great because as far as it goes, it again, recruiters, I'm sure when a lot of these came out, because I always thought I'm in the recruiting industry. I'm like, this seems like something that can be challenging and some part of a recruiter's responsibility, quote unquote. Like these are my responsibilities to screen people, right? Again, it changes the rule. It makes it so now I'm not having to ask you like, hey, are you like legally allowed to work in the United States? Like, no, a chatbot can ask that. That's not, come on, what are we doing here? So it really means the conversations I'm having are more focused on the job, like what this job is, what's required of it, what's the job going to be like. Sometimes these are almost more person-to-person conversations. Like, okay, it is in the office. What kind of office do you like working in? These are conversations that take it past the chat bots and the qualifications, and recruiters really thrive there.
And that's the next level of differentiation from a company selling why you should work for us perspective, is leveraging these AI tools at our disposal, building out personalization, building out customization, and really kind of flexing, hey, this is the employer of your dreams because we can provide you X, Y, and Z and give you all that information up front.
It's huge. I mean, when you have that to empower your job and you understand that it's not really challenging you for your job, but allowing you to focus on the parts that are a little more human, it's really empowering. So I would say with these AI tools, I know that there's a lot of anxiety on the job markets around what they mean for everyone. Do your best to figure out how you work with them. Hold their hand. That's my best advice. Speaking of advice, let's kind of get into kind of some closing thoughts here. If you had top 3 pieces of advice to someone who is in the job seeking world right now, what would those 3 be?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest one right now is stay patient. There are a ton of really highly qualified individuals out there looking for work. Like I was saying before, the job market will come back around. This is a cyclical thing. We've seen this happen before. Stay patient is number 1. Number 2, go after as much personal learning and skill development as possible. If you are, in fact, unemployed right now, use that time to upskill yourself. I mentioned AI before, but go after any certification in the field that you're interested in. Go outside of your sweet spot. Go get exposure to other technologies. And then lastly, we've been harping on the AI aspects here, but try to get as much exposure as possible to Gen AI, these chatbots, these LLMs, retrieved augmented generate. I forget the the G, but you know what I'm saying. Like, get exposed to AI. It's here. It's going to help you, and it's going to help your company be successful.
Yep. So be patient, up your skills, and if there's one skill in particular that you want to make sure you're at least sharpening the sword, it's AI. I couldn't agree more. As far as it goes, this is a tricky time, but it's also exciting. We have these shifts in the technology space only so often, and while they always create anxiety, concern, they also create these tremendous opportunities for the people who seize them. So I'm excited to see what this does for the job market, for the companies working with all this stuff. Matt Slutsky, thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Thanks to all our viewers, and we'll see you next time on the ReluTech Podcast.